Did you know that most of women's history has never been documented because of the male perspective on women in history? Women's rights have slowly started to change due to a change in the social narrative of gender roles. Being a woman in today's society has given me the interest in researching women's history. Even in my 21 years, I have witnessed an unfair amount of gender inequality in history books. I am going to be discussing women's history in the 1900s, how women's rights have changed in the present, and how our history shows no significance due to the thought of women being insignificant in history. Before the 1900s, women had no opportunity to further their education and they had no say in the political world. This quote comes from Eugene Hecker's article called A Short History in Women's Rights. By 1911, women were not given the opportunity to further their education. This statement summarizes how the world looked in the early 1900s when it came to women's rights. Back then, the rich held the power, and in today's society, the rich still hold the power, even over women and their rights. Back then, education was seen as being for men because of these gender roles that were established. These gender roles stated that men were the one who got an education and they worked to provide for their families, while women stayed at home with the children and acted as caretakers, and they did chores around the house. Hecker also stated that by this time, women were advocating for the right to vote and hold a spot in political offices. Women started fighting for the right to vote in the early 1800s, but sadly their voting rights were not established until 1920. Because of this, women were seen as less than, and this was because of the general narrative of women being the weaker sex. Moving ahead 80 years, we see changes in voting rights and are starting to see a small change in how women are viewed. We are still missing a big chunk of history because women didn't deserve to be in history according to men. This mindset was a view of the past and has consistently changed the more we progress through modern history. In 1979, an article called Women's History, Women's Rights was created in the women's perspective, telling how women were not seen in history and we could rarely find information about us. Women were only seen in history books if they had rich and powerful men in their lives, for example, their fathers, brothers, or husbands. This article was all about how women of history is a woman's right to know. Unfortunately, there was not a lot of coverage of women in the history books, and women wanted to see more. Historically, women were not seen in politics, and they were not seen as having careers other than nursing or teaching. In today's society, women are seen more in history, and we are seen more in political power, and we are sometimes seen with having more equal opportunities. Women have more job opportunities, and they are given higher incomes. This quote comes from an online article called 12 Stats About Working Women. Mothers are the primary or sole earners for 40% of households with children under the age of 18 today, compared with 11% in 1960. If you compare this quote to gender roles in the early 1900s, you can see an involvement in how women are given more opportunity. Raquel Fernandez, who is an expert in economic growth, stated in his Journal of Economic Growth that in almost all industrialized countries, women went from being the property of their husbands and or fathers with very few legal rights to possessing the same political rights and most of the same economic rights as men. To me, this shows growth of women throughout history. Women are, quote, finding their voices in society when we haven't had them before, end quote. This comes from a psychology student at UNCW named Virginia Nelson. In my opinion, if we see more women in history, then more women will be comfortable in their own bodies and be comfortable expressing themselves, asking for equality, and standing up for their political beliefs. In conclusion, women today have more rights, privileges, and freedoms than women of the past. Today, we see women having more rights, and we see more women in history. If we compare that to the early 1900s, where women were rarely given an opportunity to further their education unless they had money, and were struggling for their rights with no documented in history, we see more women in more powerful jobs and more powerful seats. I challenge you to look and see how many women you see in history and compare that to the number of men you see in history. Thank you.